Teal'dir, The Boy Who Cried Wolf and its modern incarnations. So I'm sure we're all familiar with the tale of the boy who cried wolf. Bored shepherd boy calls out, "Wolf, wolf," and the whole village comes running out in order to save their sheep. He does this a couple of times for fun and games, and then one day an actual wolf shows up, he screams wolf, no one helps him, and he gets viciously murdered. Now I can't help but think that if this boy had been a little bit smarter and yelled out the name of a different predator, there's a possibility that people might still have come to help him. After all, it's kind of difficult to ignore the cry of, "Jesus Christ, it's a lion! Get in the car!" Now, why on earth would I mention this? Well, a few times around and about the place on YouTube, I've made an observation about the ever-creeping language that the left uses in order to smear people that they don't like. It started out as simply proclaiming that they were being conservative or right-wing, and then it became reactionary, and then it became neo-reactionary, and now it's alt-right, white supremacist, and now Nazi. Now, of course, in their own minds, this term white supremacy doesn't normally mean what everyone thinks it means. The term itself came out of academic race theory, where it seems to have largely replaced previous terms. The good old buzzwords of systemic or systematic racism, because apparently systemic and systematic are interchangeable words that mean the exact same thing these days, or institutional racism or something like that. And of course, these terms were quite handy for them in order to browbeat people into submission, but of course they lacked that little visceral punch. But if you accuse someone of being a white supremacist, or you just say, well, that's white supremacy, or that's just a sign of institutional white supremacy, well, that's a lot more of a gut punch. It just conjures up in so many people instant revilement. And this is just another example of their increasing creep of the use of language. Because the systems and institutions of the West are largely staffed, overseen, and generally held up by people who are white, by virtue of the fact that most of the population is white, and as we all well know, according to them, all white people are racist, that means that every institution and system must be white supremacy. So they get to upgrade their language to something which has more of a visceral punch to it. And this is because terms like systemic racism and institutional racism kind of stopped meaning anything to people. They just heard it so often that no one cared anymore. It was like the term misogyny, or being called a misogynist. And this is something that I can't be alone in. The first time that I was genuinely called a misogynist in a non-ironic, non-humorous way by someone on the internet, I did have a moment of thinking, "You what, mate?" You had that moment of being taken aback a little bit, and then you heard out their warbled, ridiculous reasoning for labelling you as such, and you realised that that person was completely insane. And of course, as more and more people were subject to this rampant use of this word, eventually it just became water off the duck's back. They stopped hearing it as any sort of insult or attack, and stopped caring. Because the word that literally meant an unrealistic, unfounded hatred of women had transformed into someone who believes that women are not quite social or intellectual equals to men, had then translated into someone who doesn't like something in which a woman is somehow tangentially related, maybe, perhaps, somehow. See the recent backlash and or apathy to things like the current year edition of Ghostbusters and the controversy around modern Star Wars films. Oh, you don't like something because it has glaring plot holes, special effects issues, problems with sound assets? Well, that's just 'cause you hate women. Obviously, this accusation doesn't follow in any way whatsoever, but the term is still thrown around as if it's some sort of effective put-down. And this is what is happening to terms like white supremacist and Nazi. It's somewhat an inverse of what Steven Pinker dubbed the euphemism treadmill. The euphemism treadmill is an observation of a gradual shift in language where we take words that we don't really like or which have a negative connotation, and we try to find slightly nicer or more polite words for that same thing as time goes on. An example of this could be the term toilet, which eventually turned into bathroom and has now migrated onto restroom, washroom, water closet, so on and so forth. We've seen a similar thing around the description of humans who are black. The Latin word niger, literally translating as black, turning to negro and then eventually African American, which is now being subsumed under labels such as people of colour or black and minority ethnic. We're currently seeing a similar thing regarding illegal immigrants as well. Firstly, they were illegal aliens or illegal immigrants, and then they became undocumented immigrants, and then they became undocumented people. The thing that you'll notice about all of these shifts in term when it comes to the euphemism treadmill, it doesn't actually change or alter the phenomenon that you're talking about, merely the language that you use to talk about it. Which is why I find it very interesting when you keep hearing social justice types wanting to police language, almost as if they think if they ban you from using a word to describe a phenomenon, then conversation about that phenomenon will simply not happen anymore. This is of course impossible. People will simply use other terms to continue to talk about that particular phenomena. This reverse euphemistic treadmill, which I suppose you could call the invective treadmill. Invective herein meaning insulting, abusive, or highly critical language. In this case, taking words whose edge has been dulled by overuse over time and resharpening it with a new term, tapping into the fresh moral outrage that society holds towards certain topics. In the cases of the now overuse of the term white supremacy in place of terms such as systemic racism, this works to further divide society and imply that any person who is not white, who is living in any sort of difficulty, or basically living anything that could be considered a less than perfect or less than ideal life, has somehow been the victim of a bunch of swastika armband wearing jackbooted thugs. A reality that of course does not exist and is frankly ridiculous. The problem with this invective treadmill is that in constantly rehoning the edge of people's outrage towards ever smaller and smaller targets, while still using the words to define the biggest target, what then happens is that you end up in a system wherein you lose the ability to identify the weaker forms of these problems, always conflating the smallest problems with the largest problems, which is of course then a fundamental failure of classification. Hence these terms lose their meaning, and thus a stronger term is required in order to maintain the effect, almost as if it were a society-wide acclimation to accusation. The left's constant screeching over the years that George Bush is racist, Mitt Romney is racist, and now Trump is racist, because anything and everything Republican must be racist, and when all of these people fail to engage in any behaviour that could be reasonably defined as racist, the term has of course then lost its edge. So what has this got to do with white supremacy? Well, it's quite simple. White supremacy is the latest edge on the outrage knife, the next speed setting on the invective treadmill. In relentlessly calling everything you don't like white supremacy and everyone you don't like a Nazi, these terms become devalued, and eventually it just becomes another buzzing noise that people hear when the permanently offended screech off their litany of terms for heretic, because according to them, that's what you are. And bringing this topic to a close, one has to wonder, where exactly do you go now? So many edges have been dulled over the years. Right-wing no longer really has a punch, conservative doesn't cause any outrage anymore, reactionary and neo-reactionary, no one cares. Alt-right still has a little bit of a knee-jerk, but it now seems that white supremacist and Nazi are the label of the day. The problem is, there's really nothing above that. Once these terms have been devalued and are being applied to literally everyone you don't like, then there is nowhere left to go. There is nothing more outrageous that you can call someone. The only thing that I could possibly think of would be to start using the term paedophile, as being perhaps the only thing that might have a larger negative connotation to it. But that's not something that I can see the left resorting to, partially because they've already tried and failed to make use of that term when it came to the topic of sex bots, claiming that any man who wanted to have sex with a robot whose figures made the terms giant anime titties seem very underwhelming, and calling them paedophiles. Somehow that didn't work. I can't imagine why. And then there is of course the fact that ultra-progressive people are attempting to normalize paedophilia and to get P for pedosexuality added on to the GLBT list. So of course you wouldn't want to turn that word into something negative, because noting something different about someone just makes you a bigot, and you wouldn't want to be a bigot, would you? So this is the situation we're in now. The crying of wolf happened so often that everyone stopped listening. The cry of lion happened so often, everyone stopped listening. The cry of bear happened so often, everyone stopped listening. And eventually, you run out of things to shout. Which does, of course, leave the question, where do you go from here? And I can't help but think that with no other option, they might actually have to start addressing the points of their opposition. But who am I kidding? That's not going to happen. So honestly, I can't wait to see what term they try to use next in order to smear people that they don't like. But then of course the other danger is when someone does come along who is worse than a white supremacist or worse than a Nazi, how are you going to be able to tell people how dangerous that could be when you've run out of words to convince people?